a few days ago, the Ukrainian government Twitter account posted something that enraged the Japanese citizens, and that was a post picturing Adolf Hitler, Benito Mussolini, and Hirohito, the former emperor of Japan. They felt was something that was worth an apology, and they asked for the post to be canceled. Now, what happened? They did get their apology, and the post was canceled in the end. Also, thanks to a roar that started also from the Ukrainian ambassador to Japan himself, who asked the Ukrainian government to remove the post. But the question remains: shall we consider Japan during the war a fascist state or not? To discuss this, I called William Grimm, who's a native of New York City. He's a missionary since 1973. He has served in Japan, Hong Kong, and Cambodia. He's a graduate of Columbia University School of Journalism in New York, and he's the publisher of UCA News. Now, he's usually based in Tokyo, but today he joins us from New York. So hi, Bill, and welcome.
Thank you, Christian.
Yeah, so my question would be, what do you make of all this?
It's a tempest in a teapot, but people, basically people like to be offended, so they'll grab anything. It's true that even during World War II, so far as I know, the cartoons always showed Hitler, Mussolini, and Tojo, the Japanese prime minister, who was also a member of the military. I don't think they usually bothered about the emperor, because I think even then people realized the emperor really wasn't much of anything except a figurehead. So the mistake that was made in the Ukraine was they grabbed who they thought was in charge instead of the guy who really was in charge, who was Tojo, and he was a fascist. There was Japan was allied with Germany. It was part of the the three-way axis. They weren't very wrong, but they took the wrong picture.
Of course, there were lots of people that pointed this out, as well as the fact that if it was Tojo, in fact, and not Hirohito himself in this picture, then maybe Japanese wouldn't have complained. But then, if you look at just what happened a few days earlier, there was a meeting online meeting with President Zalenski, the Ukrainian President Zalenski, with the American Congress, and at that time he mentioned the Pearl Harbor incident, the attack, and he mentioned it as a compare it to what the Russian did to Ukraine in February. That was, of course, like a fascist attack or attack from this totalitarian state. And even then, the Japanese reacted very strongly on the internet, and of course, they call it right wing, but there was a strong push on this as well. And we all know that the Pearl Harbor attack was masterminded by Yamamoto, was this famous and great admiral of the Japanese fleet in the Pacific. So it wasn't something that was coming from Hirohito himself, as everybody knows. But even then, it was perceived to be something inappropriate to the Japanese. So what is going on here? Is it just like we learned a totally different history?
No, nobody likes to be pointed out as a villain. I had an experience many, many years ago of finding a history book that I had used as I think a fifth grade student in school, American history. And I looked to see what it had to say about what we call the Mexican War. And it simply said the Mexican War began in, I think, 1845. It didn't mention it began when the American army invaded Mexico, because we don't like to admit that. The Japanese, yeah, they know Pearl Harbor happened, but they just assume, make believe it didn't. For them, World War II is Hiroshima and Nagasaki. And those bombs, besides blowing away many lives and two major cities, blew away their sense of war responsibility. It turned the Japanese into victims. And they play on that because, as I say, nobody likes to admit that they were the bad guys. And I think that's a lot behind it. And especially with the right-wing people in Japan, who, of course, are big backers of the Liberal Democratic Party. And so they have disproportionate power. They'll jump on anything that says, the Japanese weren't perfect. The denial of the rape of Nanjing, They never say it didn't happen. You can't say that because that disparages our brave Japanese troops, because they can't deny the facts. So they just say you shouldn't say things that will disparage the troops. But that's not particularly unique to Japan. As I say, in 1845, the Mexican War began. And when it was over, we had Texas and New Mexico and Arizona and California. Yeah.
But if this is the case, then you have, so Japanese are teaching some history. Then you have, as you mentioned, the Americans are teaching another history. And then you have all the other allies who won the World War II with them teaching their own history. And then you have the Russians, who we always forget, but the Russians were another victor in the war.
In fact, the Russians were the main victor, but you'd never guess it. I mean, Saving Private Ryan was the high point of World War II. No, the siege of Leningrad and Stalingrad were the high points of World War II. But we just block the Soviet Union out of it because they became bad guys, or they were bad guys, and we had to admit it after the war. But during the war, they were allies. And then once it's over, we just block them out of the story, and everything becomes a D-Day and the subsequent things to that.
Now,
I'm sure, what did you learn about World War II in Italy?
Yeah,
as a child?
That is the thing, because one of the things that surprised me the most, well, it didn't surprise me at all, but I guess it surprised the Japanese editors, because I went and read the reaction of readers of Japanese English media. So we're mostly talking about expats, so English, Western people and English-speaking people living in Japan. And what the reaction was to the news of Hirohito being associated with Hitler and Mussolini, and they were unanimously and vigorously pointing out that the fact that the Hirohito or Japan himself should not be considered a fascist state is just preposterous. If I look back at my history, how I studied history, but that's exactly it. And as a matter of fact, if I talk to old people or not even my grandpa, my uncle, they all assume for a fact that Japan was a fascist state, and it still lingers on in some vein, even today's government, this fascistic attitude in some matters. So we all assume that was the case. So how do we know which history is more objective at this point?
None is. I sometimes sit down just as an exercise. Try writing your autobiography and then show it to your mother. There is no such thing as objective history. The question of, was Japan fascist? It was a military dictatorship. They controlled every element of people's lives. But part of the difficulty is finding a definition of fascism. And for the most part, fascism is simply what I don't like. I don't like what you're doing, therefore you are a fascist. And it's not a very useful phrase. But the fact is, if whatever definitions are used, certainly a military dictatorship that controlled every element of people's lives, mobilized the entire society toward militaristic ends, and made the individuals subservient to the government, that seems like a pretty fair description of what fascism is about. And in that case, yeah, Japan was a fascist country. And you can't ignore the fact that, in fact, they formed alliances with fascist countries.
And this I find it paradoxical, because if you look back at the history, and then you will definitely see this picture coming out of a Japan that invades all these countries, starting with China and Korea and Taiwan, and then it goes to Malaysia, and then Indonesia, and then the Philippines, and all these countries, and they assume to be some sort of a savior, to be a civilization of higher quality and status. But then at the same time, you have the Westerners. One of the reasons why Singapore was taken so quickly, because it wasn't defended very much, because the British thought, oh, the Empire of Japan wouldn't have this military power to take over as British, who used to be the power of the global stage.
Right. Yeah, well, it was in many ways a racist war on both sides in the Pacific, and even in the US. we didn't arrest all Germans or Italians in the US. There were some who were arrested, but the wholesale moving of Japanese Americans to basically concentration camps, nobody would have dreamed of doing that with here I'm in New York. There was a German neighborhood here called Yorkville, and they used to have Nazi meetings, and there was a huge one in Madison Square Garden. Well, the FBI never went chasing after the people once the war started.
Good that you mentioned that, because that's exactly true. We shouldn't forget the fact that during the war, many Japanese, basically all the Japanese, even if it was like a second generation Japanese.
It was more that there were blonde-haired, blue-eyed children in those camps, but they had a Japanese grandmother or grandfather, and that was enough. And yeah, and I know people who wound up in those camps. It happened all over the place. People do stupid things in wartime. Some of them are horrible. Some of them wind up being called heroism. I had one of my uncles won a very high military award during World War II, and I asked him, "What did you do?" He said, "I was 20 years old. I was stupid." So, but he did something stupid, but he got a medal for it.
If you look at Japan today, as you've been living here for many years, there's one thing that really stands out. If you compare it, if you have watched the videos of pre-war or during the war, for example, there's one video that stands out. It's when, I think it was the foreign minister of Japan, when Japan attacked China, they were asked from all the forces, American and the Western forces, to basically get out of China. And the reaction was incredible, because this foreign minister, Japanese foreign minister, with this hubris and this arrogance, went up there on the stage in front of all these representatives of the foreign powers and said basically, "No, you're all wrong."
Well, the Japanese, within their own culture, they can tend to be very subservient to one another and defer. But on the world stage, they can be very arrogant. And the biggest arrogance, of course, was the war. But even before that, going into China, when they walked out of the League of Nations, but they always managed to make themselves the victim. Once again, it comes back to, what's World War II about? The atomic bombs, and they were dropped on us. There is that tendency for the Japanese public or government, or in some ways anyway, in Japan, to paint themselves as victims of the world outside. And that goes back to basically the 17th century, when they closed themselves off from the world to protect themselves from it.
All these reactions that goes on, these extreme reactions to the news like this, is it's just because it's the internet, or is it because really is it getting more extreme somehow, somewhere?
It certainly gets amplified by social media, by the internet. Some years ago, just for the hell of it, I went to Yasukuni Shrine, the place that enshrines the war dead, including war criminals, just to see what was going on. And a busload of these right-wing folks showed up who buy the whole thing. And they got off the bus, and I realized they were all my age. They were all overweight, on the verge of old age, and they even had some women with them in order to fill out the ranks, because they're running out of people. And the whole nation of Japan is running out of people. It's a shrinking group, and the hyper-nationalists are a shrinking group, because young people, frankly, for the most part, are not interested in that sort of thing. That's why even when they say, Japan might remilitarize, who's going to join the military? Nobody. I mean, there is a big context for everything that happens in Japan, and that context is the fact that it's an aging country with a shrinking population, and the young people are, thanks in part to social media, are different from their previous generations. They're whatever, call it patriotism, call it nationalism, whatever you want. It's a different, if they have it, it's a different style from what their parents were taught and grew up with.
Of course, the fact that the Japanese are not joining the ranks of this extreme organization is definitely you can see it as a positive thing. But how about the fact that the Japanese in general, the younger generations, they are less and less interested on what goes on in politics, and we see it every time when there is an election. What is it, like 30% or something like this, that they go to vote, and it's not even that. It's like they're not even willing to discuss political things. Like there is no way to have them talk about anything political.
Yeah, I've lived in Japan for most of the past 50 years, and I cannot recall a single discussion about politics. I cannot recall being with Americans for more than 40 minutes without discussions of politics. Politics was always divorced from the people. When you had the shogunate, people were not supposed to be paying attention to it. They were just supposed to obey orders. When you had the only period where you really had political involvement was what they call the Taisho democracy, the period between the First and Second World War, or the First World War and the war moving into China. So politics has always been something remote from people's lives. They're not interested in it. Politics is something, it's a branch of the mafia, the branch of the Yakuza, and the less you have to do with them, the better. So you wind up with these dynasties, members of the Diet whose fathers and grandfathers were members of the Diet. It's a family business. And as long as things continue to work fairly well, people don't really care. They don't look to the political system to make changes.
And it's funny that you mentioned that, because this is something I thought about many times, because we all, of course, if you ask anybody, we all consider Japan to be this democracy and the same stage as the United States or European democracies. But then again, like you mentioned, there are these dynasties in the political realm, and basically you have families living up. I mean, we hear about people complaining that America had the Clinton, then the Reagan, the Bush,
the Kennedys, Bushes, Reagan. But here it's real. And part of it is that people don't really care, because what if the system works? And even now, Japan has fallen from world number 2 to world number 3. Well, that's really not a very bad drop. So as long as the system works for people, and it's by and large an honest system. And there's massive corruption, but it's all massive. It doesn't touch people's daily lives. You can't bribe your way out of a traffic ticket. Yes, you can bribe your way into getting a contract to build a bridge, but the corruption does not touch people in their daily lives the way it does in a lot of other Asian countries, or a lot of countries all over. I mean, I lived for a year in Cambodia, where if you had a fire and the fire department showed up, first you had to pay off the firemen to put out the fire. Well, it was a good reason to make sure you kept safe, but that's not the case in Japan. So the system works. And if part of the cost of making the system work is putting up with these corrupt politicians who are building bridges, all right, we'll put up with them because things function well.
Do you think, though, that the fact that they are so detached from what happens above them and the decisions that are made, that somehow beneficial to their everyday livelihood? Doesn't make them less aggressive to each other? Is there any fall down on these aspects? Because if you look at what's going on in America right now, this seems like, if you just look at from the social media, it seems like people are eating each other from the far left and the far right. Look at the abortion right now, the discussion. This would probably never happen in Japan, definitely not at this level. So do you think that in the end, the fact that they are quite detached from what goes on again on the superstructure level, so to speak, and it makes them like more able to concentrate on things they care most, like their private life or even their happiness?
Well, I'm sure you're familiar with that Japanese phrase, shikataganai. Can't do anything about it. That's one of the core principles of life in Japan. What the politicians do, we can't do anything about it. So why waste energy on it? And that's the attitude toward the whole political thing. Now, on another level, the corruption at that higher level does affect, because money gets wasted, projects are conducted that are not needed. So it does have an impact on people's lives, but it's not an immediate and an immediately understandable impact.
It's interesting what you say. We all know that phrase, and I thought about this a lot. Then there are even museums about this, about the 70s, for example. Let's pick the 70s, when the whole world had this generation of rebels, of the things were changing. There were the past culture were criticized, the new culture were trying to be established, and basically seemed really like the young generation devoured the old and trying to put their own perspective on life and on the institutions, because they were about to choose like even by putting themselves at risk, by example, occupying schools, universities, and getting very political at the base level, organizing meetings and having groups and discussing politics every day. And so if you look at the 70s in Japan, they had, I mean, I was really shocked when I first saw in some YouTube video, I guess, massive demonstrations on the street, with people running around.
Yeah, there were huge demonstrations, and then they took over Tokyo University. But because it's Japan, you can even see it today in Tokyo, if you go to Harajuku and see all the kids dressing up with purple hair and all the rest of it. But then Sunday evening, they all go into the public restrooms and wash the purple dye out of the hair and get all those rioters in the 60s graduated, got into the Japanese system. It's a very enveloping and comforting system, or it was. You got guaranteed lifetime employment, you got housing, you got everything you needed, but you had to conform. And part of the conforming for students was, in fact, to get out and riot and beat each other up with steel poles and all the rest of it. But that was, in many cases, it was just theater. It's what we're supposed to do. Because we're college students and they're doing it in Paris, we have to do it in Tokyo. But then Act 2 comes along and they put on a necktie and they get on a train and commute an hour and a half every morning to go to the office.
And it's even more true when you think about it, like you just an everyday life and experience. When you talk to 70-year-olds and never talk about back in the days we used to demonstrate on the streets. It never happens. When you talk with an Italian or a French, they would tell you about it.
Yeah, those were my best days when I was out there. Yeah, no, the Japanese, they won't talk about it because they've outgrown it. In the most part, it didn't have any political depth to it because the students didn't have much political savvy. They weren't following world events. They were just doing what people do. So I had one colleague, an older colleague, who said he wound up caught in the middle of one of those demonstrations. They're screaming anti-American slogans and all the rest of it. And the kid turned to him and said, "Are you an American?" He said, "Yeah." "Oh, hey, can I practice English with you?"
It's all part of the Japanese conformity, basically. It's like,
yes, even nonconformity is very conformist. And go to Harajuku, where all the kids are dressed the same, using the same slang to show that they're nonconformist. Okay.
Well, let's close it at that. Well, Bill, thank you so much for joining us.
Oh, thank you.
It's been very good to see you, and thanks for your insight on this matter. Thank you so much.
Okay, thank you, Christian. Good luck with your work.